Oregon and Washington are off to the Big Ten, while Arizona State, Utah, and Colorado will go to the Big 12, effectively turning West Coast college football on its head. And we are so lucky to always have our West Coast guru Blair with us here. But with a story this massive, we're bringing in the quad box. We're welcoming in national recruiting editor Brandon Huffman and national recruiting analyst Greg Biggins. Guys, a lot to unpack here. But let's start with the newest Big Ten members, Oregon and Washington. They joined USC and UCLA to make the strangest conference footprint. But when it comes to recruiting, Lincoln Riley also had some thoughts on that.
We're going to recruit locally and nationally as hard as we can. We came here to win national championships. Win national championships, you're competing against everybody. So in my mind, nothing's changed. It's not like, it doesn't matter what conference you're in. Most schools in the country are going to come recruit in Southern California, right? There's a lot of good players out here. So, very confident in our brand, very confident in our approach, and our goals are completely unaffected by anything today.
Huff, I'll start with you. First off, do you agree with what he had to say? How could these additions impact the LA school's pursuit of West Coast prospects?
Well, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference because they were already impacting the USC and UCLA pursuits of those recruits, given that they know that Southern California is wide open. There's been a long time kind of wide open gate into the Southland to recruit if you are an out-of-state school, if you're an out-of-area school. We've seen Ohio State come to the West Coast. We've seen Michigan do it as well. So all it is doing is now giving Oregon and Washington a little extra ammo in their pursuit of those Southern California recruits. I think if you look at UCLA for a perfect example, they don't even really recruit high school kids all that much. They would much rather focus on the portal. So I don't think it's going to impact UCLA's pursuit of those LA recruits. I think with USC trying to recruit nationally, with Lincoln Riley's national name and USC's national name, they've been recruiting nationally. So I don't think it's going to have as big of an impact as maybe you'd think with Oregon and Washington because they've been recruiting Southern California for so long.
I would agree with what Huff said. I will say this. I think probably both USC and UCLA probably silently or maybe not silently were kind of hoping that they'd be the only two Pac-12, Pac-10, whatever schools you want to call them, that were going to another Big Ten type conference, right? I think they probably thought, man, if Washington, Oregon are kind of, relegated to a lower level conference, it definitely gives them a little bit more ammo now that Oregon and Washington, two national brands, are both out there and both able to recruit from the same kind of level playing field that USC and UCLA does. I think maybe it probably hurts just a little bit, right? Just a little bit for SC and UCLA. Again, all four of these schools have national brands. USC, I would say, and Oregon especially do a great job recruiting nationally. Washington's coming up, and then UCLA also has a pretty global brand themselves. So I think all four schools now kind of level playing field, but I don't know if Oregon or USC or UCLA necessarily loved having those two teams added to the Big Ten.
Yeah, Greg, you mentioned that they have a global brand. They already recruit nationally, so not a lot changes. You look at last year's top quarterbacks, great example, UCLA landing Dante Moore out of Michigan and Tennessee getting Nico Iamaleava from California. So how much does regionality actually matter in recruiting nowadays?
I think it does matter still a little bit. End of the day, I think kids want to stay close to home, everything being equal, right? And don't miss out, that last part, everything being equal. I think right now we have seen Southern California players leave and go elsewhere, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. I think parents want to be able to see their kids and be able to travel much easier. And I think that's going to be the big thing right now was watching how it impacts both UCLA, USC and UCLA. Can they go in and recruit Midwest kids easier? Again, USC already was able to recruit. UCLA just picked up a couple of players from outside the regions. I think being able to go out there and recruit outside of the region in Big Ten country is going to be pretty big for both schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I think regionality is huge for these programs specifically, right? Oregon, Washington, they are trying their best to keep those local prospects home and get those players to stay in the Pacific Northwest. This is going to allow them to be a little bit more enticing, to be a bit more attractive in terms of, being able to say, hey, look, you don't have to go very far to play big time football. You don't have to leave the region to play under the bright lights. And when we are talking about NIL and we're talking about marketing and branding yourself, that's what you want, is that you want that bigger stage. You want that platform to be able to showcase yourself. And I think Washington and Oregon specifically have to be doing backflips because, like Greg alluded to earlier, USC and UCLA were kind of out in front of things. They were out and saying, hey, look, we're going to go and make a move, and we're going to be playing under the bright lights of the Big Ten in those big matchups. Well, now it's going to be an even level playing field, and it's going to make it a little bit easier, I would say, for Oregon and Washington to recruit.
And Blair, you mentioned at the top of the show talking to some Arizona recruits. It's going to be a trio of Pac-12 schools now moving to the Big 12 with Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah. They, of course, follow Colorado, who joined last weekend. But I want to know who has the biggest impact when it comes to recruiting. Is it one of the 4 new schools that are gaining that conference stability? Or is it maybe the Big 12 conference now having a presence out west?
I'm giving the edge to those new schools having that conference to go to, right? Having that clarity that Damon Williams alluded to this past weekend is just knowing that that's where you're going to be playing your ball, and you don't have to answer those questions to recruits. Those recruits are wondering what's going to happen to ASU, what's going to happen to Arizona, where is Utah going to be in all of this after winning back-to-back Pac-12 championships. Well, now that answer is there, and it's very clear that the roadmap is in the Big 12, and I think it's going to allow those programs, which were already going into the state of Texas and going national to get some recruits, it's going to only help them do that. Yeah, sure, the Baylors of the world, Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, schools like that were going regionally, and I even think about an Iowa State, right, which had been making a lot of inroads in the state of Arizona, being their biggest alum in recent years, Brock Purdy, an Arizona guy. That's going to help them recruit a little bit, to sell a future road game in your home state. But I do think that when we think about edges and we think about this being an advantage, it has to go to the 4 schools.
Yeah, and I'd follow up with what Blair said and just kind of agree with everything he said in terms of those schools' stability is what's really mattering. It wasn't like the Big 12 wasn't already having success in the West, out in California. I mean, Oklahoma and Texas have long tried to recruit the West Coast. Obviously, Steve Sarkisian, with his Southern California ties, got Malik Murphy 2 years ago out of Southern California, out of Los Angeles, at a school that UCLA and USC and Oregon have always tried to recruit pretty heavily. So Texas has made the West Coast a kind of a focal point in the last few years under Steve Sarkisian, whereas Oklahoma had already done that under Bob Stoops and again under Lincoln Riley. So they already had a little bit of a presence, and now they get maybe a couple extra states that they didn't have as much of a presence in the state of Utah, in Arizona, in Colorado. For those 4 schools to no longer, like Blair said, have to answer questions from recruits. Where are you going? Where are you headed? And I think if you're Utah, I mean, you got to feel really good about yourself because 12 years ago, you were making that move from a Group of 5 school to a Power 5 school. They were kind of one of the first to do that in recent years, along with TCU, who played for a national title last year. Houston, BYU, UCF, Cincinnati, they were all looking to have the same kind of success at the Power 5 level that Utah did. And now Utah, for the second time, is a desired school by a Power 5 program. So if we're going to pick one of those schools, I think Utah might even be in better shape just because they have had so much success in football in the last few years. They've had success in football going back 20 years. Colorado had the success 30 years ago. They've been very dismal for the last 15, 20 years. Arizona and Arizona State have both been up and down, but the model of consistency in the Pac-12 since the Pac-12 became a conference in 2011 has been Utah, and now they're going to be able to further cement themselves with those inroads they've had in the state of Florida, with the inroads they've had in the state of Texas, with the success that they're now having keeping those in-state kids home, but then also that success they've had out west in California, in Nevada, in Arizona. I think Utah, of the 4 from the Pac-12 that have made that move, they position themselves that much better than they've already been positioned for the last dozen years.
Yeah, the recruiting pitches may change just slightly, but I have trouble using the word stability because college football is anything but stable right now, but definitely more stability than those 4 teams that now make up the Pac-4, and that is Oregon State, Washington State, Cal, and Stanford. Potentially maybe movement with the ACC when it comes to Cal and Stanford, but as we're talking right here on Monday, their future still very much up in the air, but recruiting never stops. The recruits are not going to wait to figure out what happens. So Huff, how does the news impact those schools kind of left behind for the rest of this 24 cycle?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a case-by-case basis because all 4 schools are so unique. I mean, obviously, Oregon State and Washington State were reeling when their in-state rivals got the invite to the Big Ten, and then the other Pac-12 schools got the invite to the Big 12. and they had nowhere else to go. So right now, if you're Washington State and Oregon State, you're worried so much about what your future is going to hold. Is it going to be in the Mountain West? Is it going to be the Big 12? Is it going to be the ACC? Is it going to be the American? You don't know where your future of your program is headed. So you're trying to figure out where you're going and then try to keep all those 2024 recruits. That doesn't even take into account the 25 and 26 recruits that you're trying to go after. You're more in a survival of the fittest right now to find out where you're landing. And what Oregon State and Washington State have had that's been unique in the Pac-12 is they've got that small college town feel that you have these other suburban schools or these schools that are in the big city. Oregon State and Washington State have been off the beaten path, so it's kind of a unique recruitment for when they bring guys there anyway. But now there's the instability of the conference. I think both those schools are kind of left in a position now where there's a lot of understandable panic. With Cal and Stanford, there is the ties to the ACC that's being discussed. They're, the two brands that they have. I think Cal and Stanford, they do have the academic side. Stanford, I think even more so, because Stanford recruits on a national level. They're not going to recruit California, Southern California, Northern California as heavily as the other Pac-12 schools were recruiting their backyards. They are a national brand. They're a global brand. So Stanford's going to be able to continue to recruit because kids are picking Stanford, as we heard under the David Shaw era, the 40-year decision, not the 4-year decision. So a kid that picks Stanford isn't going to be as concerned with the conference affiliation as much as he's going to be concerned with the Stanford education. Whereas Cal could be kind of closer to Oregon State and Washington State in that land of the unknown, more so than with Stanford. Even though Cal is a prestigious academic university, given kind of how football and basketball have backslid in a few years, they may be closer to Oregon State and Washington State, where even their academics aren't helping them with recruiting. They could be one of those schools that's really in flux, just given the lack of success, the massive amount of debt. I mean, they're getting $10 million just from UCLA alone, making the move to the Big Ten. So finances aren't strong in Berkeley. That's one of those things that now you have to take that into account, is what is Cal's next move just from an overall athletic department with no conference right now seemingly wanting them.
I think Huff took most of my answers as well, so I'll try to be a little shorter and sweet. No, I agree with all that. I've kind of gone back and forth on this, honestly. I think Stanford could go independent. Like Notre Dame, I think it's a great brand, not just for football, basketball, but Olympic sports as well. Other three schools, I'm kind of curious. I've kind of gone back and forth. How is this going to affect those schools? When you go to Oregon State or you pick a Washington State, you're not necessarily picking them because of the conference, right? I do think you like the idea of going to Oregon State and then competing against USC, competing against Oregon, UCLA. I do think, that matters. So from that standpoint, I think conference affiliation matters. But at the same time, I think kids, like Huff mentioned, man, it's an awesome small college town feel. I've been to all those schools. I love the vibe, and I think that's still going to remain. At the end of the day, these kids still do want to go to a Power 5 conference, but I don't think it's going to cripple them. I don't think it's hurt necessarily Boise State or even SDSU, Fresno State. I'm not trying to relegate those three schools to the Mountain West just yet. So I've kind of gone back and forth, and again, I'm kind of curious to see how it all is going to play out.
You're still selling the brand, you're selling all the other things that come with it, just not the conference, since that's a big fat question mark. Greg, with all that happened in the Pac-12 on Friday, it's hard not to look at this as kind of the beginning of the end for the Conference of Champions. This is a conference that you know very well. I mean, what hope is there, if any, that the Pac-12 will survive and grow with this core 4 schools left?
Yeah, no, I don't have a lot of hope, and I am a Pac-12, Pac-10 homer. I've always been that way. I'm kind of sad, I'll be honest with you. I love seeing the natural rivalries. I love watching the Arizona schools, the Washington schools, obviously USC, UCLA. That was fun for me. And again, I'm an Olympic sport guy, so I'm going to miss seeing, the soccer, volleyball, water polo even. Like, I loved all that. So from that standpoint, I don't see you have those 4 schools. You want to bring in, 6 to 8 other schools? I just don't know if there's a lot of juice out there left to maybe make this conference a legitimate Power 5 conference. It just seems like those 4 schools are kind of looking elsewhere now. Don't want to give up hope just yet, right? I mean, if Blair can rock that zebra shirt, then anything's possible. So honestly, I'm not trying to give it up. We didn't give up on Pearl Harbor, so there's always hope. But saying all that, I'm not really optimistic right now.
I mean,
Greg, I will rebuttal this. All right, so I pulled this out from Pac-12 Media Day 2 years ago. And I don't even know if I should have taken it out of the wrapper because it might be a relic, but it's got the Pac-12 branding. So I'm going to hold on to this in case the conference ever comes back. But in the meantime, I'm just going to do this and pop my collar a little bit.
You can. Hey, I can't pull it off. You can pull it off, though, Blair. God bless you for that whole ensemble you got going there.
It's incredibly impressive, a lot more impressive than what we saw happen to the sport of college football over the weekend. But Blair, I'm glad that you can still be smiling and having a positive attitude. And Greg, it's a bummer what's happening to the Pac-12, but you never know what's going to happen next. It's continually changing every hour. I'm just excited to kick off with some actual football.